Hello and welcome to our very first ever TB Ed Talk, a new series from TB Fighters where every month we sit down with experts in the world of TB and learn about the thing that they are the expert in and ask them questions. My name is Tori and I'll be your host tonight. First of all, happy Pizzamas to everyone celebrating. And for the people who don't know about Pizzamas, that's going to be a really fun thing for you to Google later. With me here is our amazing guest. She is the Advocacy Specialist for Economic Justice on the Global Advocacy Team at Partners in Health, where her work focuses on advancing policy solutions at the state, federal, and multilateral level to unlock adequate funding for universal healthcare. She's been organizing for the right to health for 6 years, previously based in Washington State, where she graduated from the University of Washington in 2023 with a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and bioethics. Please join me in welcoming one of the smartest and kindest people I know, Chloe Dahleen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tori, for that incredible and kind introduction. And thanks for having me, TB Fighters. I'm so excited. Someone told me today that being with TB Fighters is good for the soul, so I'm having some good soul times right now. And also, I can't help but start by abusing my speaker powers to tell everyone that Tori is not only an excellent friend, but a fearless nerd fighter, a Hill Day master planner, and that probably makes the best PowerPoints anyone has ever seen in the universe. It's actually kind of infamous. So thanks so much for hosting me tonight, Tori.
That is too kind, Chloe. It's just going to be like, yeah, going back and forth about how great everybody is.
Amazing. And I also want to say before we get started, thanks to the nerd fighters who are behind the scenes doing all the tech work tonight. We couldn't do this without you guys, so
yes,
much appreciated.
Tech work and our mods who are all the best. So before Chloe gets started, since this is everyone's first time here, I'm going to just go over quickly about how this is going to go. We've got a couple of quick announcements now, and then Chloe's going to walk us through her talk. If you have questions for her during the presentation, put them in the YouTube chat, and our amazing mods will get them over to us. When Chloe's done, we're going to ask a mix of live and pre-submitted questions. We'll close out by telling you who our October speaker is going to be, as well as sharing a few upcoming TB Fighters events. The last thing before we get started, if you are based in the US or Canada, take a look in the doobly-doo, the little description box of this video. We have a few actions that you can take tonight to help in the fight for global health funding. And that is all from me up front. I'm going to turn it over to Chloe.
Awesome. Thanks, Tori. All right, let me see if I can properly share my screen here. Cool. All right, someone yell at me, specifically Tori, yell at me if people cannot see these slides. Here we go. Thanks everyone who decided that learning about tuberculosis and debt and taxes sounded like a fun Tuesday night activity. I hope I will be at least somewhat entertaining. In honor of John's book, Everything is Tuberculosis, which if you haven't read, you should all go read. I'm calling this presentation Everything is Debt and Taxes. And hopefully by the end of this hour, I will have convinced everyone watching this that everything really is debt and taxes, including TB. And also, John, if you see this, consider this my formal pitch for the sequel. All right. Okay, so what would it cost to actually end TB? Tonight, when we're talking about ending TB, we're talking about procuring the financial resources to do so. So, in reality, obviously, there's so much more that needs to be done if we're actually talking about ending tuberculosis. Once you have the money, you have to spend it on the right treatments, programs, research and development, social support, all of the things that come with ending a disease. But because I have about 30 minutes, I am just going to focus on the financial resources that would be needed to end TB. So we're going to focus on bringing in the money to do this work. I will leave the rest of the amazing stuff to the other wonderful TB Ed talks, who Tori will share about our next one at the very end of this. So super exciting stuff coming up as well. Okay, and then another thing I wanted to preface with too is for our non-TB fighters here, when I say end TB, we're not talking about just like managing or reducing TB. We're actually talking about eradicating TB. It's a treatable and preventable disease, and we could eliminate it from this earth if we wanted to. It also is the world's number one infectious disease killer. COVID surpassed it for a little bit, but it's now beat out COVID again. So I think, ending TB would be pretty sweet. So, all right, into it. What would it cost to end TB? Well, luckily for us, some very smart researchers at the Stop TB Partnership came up with some estimates. So specifically, they predicted that it would cost about $250 billion to end TB by 2030. This requires spending about $15 to $22 billion annually for TB programming. Meanwhile, the universal healthcare gap, which is what it would cost to provide, basic healthcare to everyone in the world, is around 400 billion per year. So let's put $250 billion into perspective. This chart on the left shows $250 billion as a portion of the wealth of the world's roughly 3,000 billionaires. So it comes out to about 1.5% of the $16 trillion that those folks own. And then the chart on the right shows, $250 billion, right, is for the total ending TB, but that's, about $22 billion on the high end per year, right? So the right chart shows $22 billion as a portion of the annual US Department of Defense budget, which is about, or was about 850 billion in FY25 or fiscal year 25. So that comes out to about 3%. It's also, my amazing colleague Rosie told me this fact, it is about the cost of 2 Ford-class aircraft carriers, which run about $13 billion each. So I don't know about y'all, but I think I would rather end TB than purchase 2 aircraft carriers. Okay, so hopefully that has convinced you that the world has the financial resources to end tuberculosis, actually more than a couple times over. So what is the problem? It's not that we're not trying. We have made some incredible advances towards ending TB, which I would be remiss not to point out, right? Programs like PEPFAR and the Global Fund, which saving them is the action item that's linked in the doobly-doo. So please go do that after this. Those programs have saved tens of millions of lives, and new research and development has enabled us to access higher efficacy drugs, which have lower side effects and better treatments. And we've been able to dramatically lower the costs of many of these drugs. A lot of that work has been thanks to TB fighters and other activists who have been pressuring drug companies to lower those costs. And so, all of this tireless work of researchers, activists, and advocates, impacted communities, people living with TB, have really made huge strides towards ending this disease. And I don't want to, I want to make sure to acknowledge all of that work. But as a world, right, we're only currently spending about $5 to $6 billion on tuberculosis annually, which is a far cry from the 15 to 22 billion that we need. And official development assistance or foreign aid, right, is backsliding dramatically right now. Experts are actually predicting that foreign aid is going to be at the lowest point it's been in the past decade. So, that's a huge problem that we need to address, right? But official development assistance in some form is transactional, right? It sort of inherently involves a power dynamic where the person who is donating the money gets to decide a lot of things about where that money actually gets spent. So we can do a lot of good, don't get me wrong, but it's not a substitute for sovereignty. All the same, right? As I just said, we need money if we're going to end TB. But if increasing available ODA, increasing the amount of money that goes in through aid, grants, and other things is one side of the coin, the other side of the coin, which I'm going to introduce you to tonight, is decreasing harmful outflows that are preventing adequate spending on TB. All right, so if you know me, you know this is my favorite slide. Why are poor countries poor? Well, while rich countries, like to tout the generosity of their approximately $2 trillion aid that they spend every year, also every year, at least $5 trillion, probably more, is extracted from the global south to the global north. So the flow of money is actually about $3 trillion outwards annually. So what is this $3 trillion made up of? Well, it's mostly debt and taxes. By that, I mean lost tax revenue. So debt payments represent about $1.4 trillion of this money, and illicit financial flows, or in other words, tax abuse, represent about $1.7 trillion annually. And there's another large portion that comes from patent payments, but we don't have time to talk about those tonight. It is also a problem. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so at this point, you might be asking, how did this happen? To get into the reasons why, we have to go back to formal colonialism. And we could spend ages and ages talking about this, so I'm going to very dramatically simplify things, so please bear with me. But the colonial era was essentially overt plunder from the global south through violence and military dominance, right? Just directly stealing resources and labor from countries. And when many countries started to gain formal independence around the 1950s and 1960s, they began using these natural resources and their tax base for funding public systems like healthcare, education, and they did quite well at this actually. Sierra Leone, for example, which we'll talk about later as well, created a plan for universal healthcare access for every Sierra Leonean. But of course, this was dangerous for the global north, who had already enriched themselves on critical minerals, agricultural products, and labor extraction from the global south. So in order to maintain their profit, they needed a way to maintain control over this. So they developed and utilized undemocratic institutions to control the global economy via the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the OECD, the World Trade Organization, and others. And we'll get under the hood of a few of those in a little bit. One of my favorite quotes from the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso before he was assassinated, Thomas Sankara, he said, "Debt is a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa, intended to subjugate its growth and development through foreign rules." Okay, but before we talk about debt, we're going to talk about taxes. So everything is taxes, right? Taxes are a large component of what we call domestic resource mobilization. So that's how countries generate their own revenue. In order to perform the basic functions of government, right, providing services to people, you need money to do that. And a primary way that a government generates revenue is by taxing its people. So the government collects money from people and then they provide services in return, theoretically, right? The problem arises when a government can't collect taxes on the revenue that comes from their country. So we are going to walk through an example of how this might work with Sierra Leone. Okay, back to our colonialism theme. Sierra Leone was under British rule from 1787 to 1961. While the British had control of Sierra Leone, they were providing lumber, oils, critical minerals, and other commodities for British markets. Sierra Leone was also a hotspot for the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. About 400,000 Sierra Leoneans were enslaved over the course of that. And of course, Sierra Leone had a highly profitable diamond business. So by 1737, British companies were extracting up to 1 million carats of diamonds from Sierra Leone a year. That totals about $25 billion in today's money. And all of this money, of course, is not going to Sierra Leone while it's controlled by the British. It's going directly to the British Empire to continue enriching those in power. So Sierra Leone gained independence in 1961, but its economy remained tied to these extractive industries, and there was little money left for quality public institutions. So, as was the case in many countries, the sort of lack of a strong, public system caused social and political tensions to arise. And in Sierra Leone, also, there were tensions over control over these diamond fields because they were so profitable. And this caused civil war to break out in Sierra Leone from 1991 to 2002. In 2002, control of Sierra Leone's largest diamond mine, the Koidu diamond mine, was handed over as payment to an external mercenary group that was hired by the government to help fight the rebels in the civil war to end the war. And this mercenary group transferred the ownership of the mine to Koidu Holdings, the company that owns it today. And Koidu Holdings is owned by a company called Octea, which is in turn owned by a diamond billionaire. In this way, right, after its independence, Sierra Leone didn't even own its most profitable diamond mine. And like I said, we're using Sierra Leone as an example here, but this is, a story that happened to many global South economies that were trapped into these types of extractive arrangements, even following colonialism. But even if they don't own the mine, right, the government should, in theory, be able to tax it just like any other company pays taxes where it operates, right? Well, the Koidu mine produces around 60 to 90% of Sierra Leone's annual diamond exports. That's over 100 million in profit annually. But tax registers actually don't document the company paying any national income taxes at all. And many of this information had to be leaked in the Panama Papers. In September 2024, Sierra Leone's finance minister stated that Sierra Leone exported $1.5 billion worth of minerals, but only 16 million was recorded in the national treasury. There are other ways that extractive companies avoid taxes as well, right? So aside from just straight up not paying, hiding the money in tax havens, misreporting profits on their books, money laundering, and dozens of other ways. Broadly, these things are called illicit financial flows. Experts estimate that from 2004 to 2014, Sierra Leone lost over $558 million per year to illicit financial flows. For comparison, Sierra Leone currently spends around $63 million on health, and many countries are losing 5 to 10 times their health budgets in illicit financial flows every year. So as you can imagine, it's really hard to put up a robust tuberculosis response when you're spending so much more money, or not spending, when you're losing so much more money to these illicit financial flows than you have for resourcing your health services. Okay, so here's why this is a problem. Imagine you're a customer in the United States. You're buying a diamond ring from Tiffany. I say Tiffany because they had a contract for over 50% of Octea's diamonds. You spend, let's say, $5,000 to $30,000 on your diamond ring in the US. And that money goes straight to Tiffany & Co., their associated shareholders, and their employees. Meanwhile, the mine that Tiffany is contract with is paying Sierra Leoneans as little as 65 cents a day to mine diamonds. And these low wages are going towards communities in Sierra Leone. So when their respective governments, right, the US government or the Sierra Leone government, wants to go tax these things to provide things like hospitals, military, roads and bridges, etc., the US government has a ton more money to tax than Sierra Leone. And we call this profit depletion. But as I mentioned, there are dozens of other ways that money escapes from this, system. Unreported taxes, tax havens, simply not paying taxes, all of these, right? And again, we're using Sierra Leone as a case study. It's not the exception. This is the norm for global South countries. Okay, so how are these companies getting away with it? Like, shouldn't there be some sort of global rules around multinational corporations and debt collection or tax collection? How is this legal? Well, okay, some of it is actually not legal, but some of it is legal. And either way, there's not good enforcement for any of these things. And that is because the body that currently governs all of these rules is called the OECD, which was established in, you guessed it, 1961. And the OECD sets all of the rules and regulations around international tax collection. It's made up of 38 member countries, the vast majority of which are wealthy countries. There actually isn't a single African member of the OECD. And despite making up about 17% of the world's population, these countries actually govern all of the global rules around enforcement against illicit financial flows. And of course, this was set up as the Global North was losing control over the Global South in the wake of these sovereignty movements. Okay, so now we know that the Global North still controls many of the resources of Global South countries. And on top of that, they don't pay adequate taxes on them, right? So where are Global South governments supposed to get money from when they need to finance public services like schools, hospitals, and roads? because they're unable to harness domestic financing, they have to turn towards external sources, right? So aside from the small amount that comes in aid and grants, this is mostly debt. So post-colonialism, again, many countries who were, formerly under colonial rule, all of their infrastructure was set up for extractives, right? So any like railroads they had was just like to a mine and to a port. It's not connecting towns or, providing roads that people can take to a hospital, none of that. So they really desperately needed to finance industrialization and development projects for their people. When this first started, wealthy countries were just directly providing loans to poor countries in US dollars at variable interest rates. So when the US, jacked up its interest rates to protect its central bank during times of economic hardship, it instantly made all of these loans way more expensive for low-income countries. And this is actually what caused the first debt crisis in the 1980s, where a dozen countries defaulted on their debt. Okay, so to obtain new financing now, countries had to go to the International Monetary Fund, which is a multilateral development bank that was set up by, you guessed it, the Global North post World War II. Because countries had to go to the IMF to get more debt, to pay off their existing debt, debt became a vicious cycle, right? Countries needed more loans to pay off their existing loans. And so because of the IMF being a multilateral development bank, this means that pretty much all countries are members of the IMF with a couple exceptions. So these countries are expected to pay into the IMF, and then the IMF is supposed to function as sort of a, international lender, regulator, even to countries that are so poor that no one else will loan them money. Here's the catch, of course. The IMF is governed by its country shareholders, whose voting shares are determined by the size of their economies. So for every one vote that the wealthiest countries have, the poorest countries have just a fraction of a percent of a vote. And the US has veto power over all IMF decisions. So when they needed money from the IMF, countries had to agree to pretty much any of the terms and conditions that the Global North could put on this money. So of course, the Global North forced these programs called structural adjustment policies onto countries that needed loans, which essentially enabled them to enforce economic policy in those countries that would redirect the economies towards benefiting the Global North. So these were things like austerity measures, which is just cutting basic social services for people, privatization of resources, like refusing to allow them to nationalize resources, especially valuable resources like critical minerals and oil, currency devaluation, and many more. These actually do continue today, although after getting a bad reputation, they were renamed. They're now called Poverty Reduction Strategy Programs, among a couple other fun names that the IMF has for them. And one very popular condition of these is a wage bill constraint, which restricts the amount of workers governments are able to hire. This has caused massive shortages of community health workers and nurses because governments are literally told by the IMF, you cannot hire any more of these people and you cannot pay them more than this amount as a condition of receiving money from the IMF. So obviously, not being able to hire health workers prevents a robust tuberculosis response.
That's literally the craziest thing I've ever heard.
Isn't it? It's the most popular recommendation that the IMF gives actually to countries.
Cool.
Okay, so aside from the IMF, who owns all this debt? A lot of it is multilateral, so the International Monetary Fund, other development banks like the World Bank. A good chunk of it is bilateral. That's when, just regular countries loan to other countries. So most of that is like wealthy countries doing the lending and poor countries receiving the loans. And then increasingly private creditors. These are hedge funds and other wealth management companies, mostly based in New York and London. And their debt is the most expensive, but because private creditors can't, give structural adjustment policies to countries, it contains less of those conditionalities, which is why it becomes increasingly popular. And they now own, a large share of developing country debt. It's about 60% on average. And so that's one reason why debt costs are so high. Okay, so because of these incredibly high debt costs, we're currently in a debt crisis. The UN actually estimates that 3.4 billion people, which is over a third of the world, now live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on either education or health. The IMF estimates that nearly 70 countries, again, more than a third of the world's countries, are in or at risk of debt distress. And like I mentioned, low income countries pay 4 to 5 times the interest rates that higher income countries paid. And many of them have paid off their debt multiple times because of this. Debt servicing costs are actually right now more expensive than they've been over the past 2 decades. And many countries are teetering on the edge of default. Okay, so what does all this mean for TB? Well, I wanted to shout out my brilliant colleague, Erin, at Treatment Action Group. She's put together a paper, it's linked in the doobly-doo, which explores the impacts of debt on tuberculosis. It's called Magic Mountains of Debt, and you should all read it. But essentially, despite Erin in this paper outlines that despite a good amount of foreign aid going to tuberculosis, countries actually right now mostly use domestic resources to cover tuberculosis programs. So when they're spending, up to 40% of their revenue on debt, that's directly taking money away that they could be investing in TB programs. Aside from that, right, just the sheer spending of it all, countries that have to implement austerity measures are forced to rely more heavily on donors for TB drugs. They purchase fewer TB test cartridges. They employ fewer community health workers, and they're unable to invest in research and development for tuberculosis. So this chart here, Erin looked into some high TB burden countries, and you can see in the last two columns there, they're spending hundreds and thousands of times more on debt interest payments alone than on tuberculosis. Okay, so let's begin to wrap here with some solutions. Okay, so now that we know that illicit financial flows and exorbitant debt payments are pulling trillions of dollars out of the global south and preventing adequate investment in TB, what are we supposed to do to fix this? Okay, we're going to start with taxes. Which there's actually a very exciting development in the tax world right now. After years and years of campaigning, in like 10 to 15 years, in 2019, the African group of UN member states was able to call for the development of a UN tax convention. And in October 2023, they tabled a draft resolution for this, which in a month later was adopted in a historic vote, which kickstarted the process to set up this convention. So this will, for the first time in history, create an actually inclusive global tax body where all countries can participate on equal footing to address these illicit financial flows, and also, increase governance and enforcement of companies that disobey these rules. It'll help increase transparency and cooperation between governments in terms of tax law and tax rules, and it'll help create just a more coherent set of global tax rules and standards. This is actually perhaps one of the biggest positive developments in the entire global economy. And it's one that very few people have heard of, but it's currently under negotiation for the next 3 years. Ideally, the first part of it is supposed to be done in 2027. So it's something I'm watching very eagerly because this has the opportunity to take that power away from the OECD, right? Which could actually be the solution to all of these trillions of dollars of illicit financial flows, which would be really huge. Okay, moving on to some solutions for debt. In order to break the chains of debt, we need a couple things. Well, many things, but debt cancellation first. There are a couple historical examples of debt cancellation, but there's really been a very small amount of debt cancellation across the course of history. Programs like the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries program, the debt suspension program during COVID have helped write down or suspend debts in the past. But part of the reasons these programs failed in the past, HIPC and MDRI, the first two were in the early 2000s, or the late 90s, early 2000s. And they just didn't cancel enough of the debt. In fact, actually, in the debt world, one of our names for the HIPIC program is the half-hearted, inadequate, piecemeal cancellation, which is a fun acronym for it.
Great name.
Right. But also, right, if you can't do domestic resource mobilization, if you can't, you know, collect the taxes that you need to collect, it doesn't like really matter if you have debt cancellation, right? Because you still won't have access to domestic financing, so you still need to go back and get external financing. So without the availability of, more foreign aid or grants, without the solution to taxes, you can't like really fully get out of this debt trap. So we need to solve the tax problem to solve the debt problem. Also, I have to mention that debt is not inherently bad. That might be a question bouncing around in a couple people's minds. Wealthy countries actually hold the most of the world's sovereign debt. And it is a popular thing for US politicians to freak out about these days, actually. But because the US has a hegemonic currency, meaning like the US has the most powerful dollar in the world, um, by force and by these economic arrangements we've just been talking about, the U.S. government could actually just like print more money, and adjust fiscal policy and be fine at the expense of everyone else. But they could do that, right? Um, Poorer countries whose debts are oftentimes denominated in foreign currencies, they don't have this same option. They can't just manipulate their central bank to make their debt go away, right? So they do actually need debt cancellation. Okay, next is debtor organizing. We just actually quite some time ago there was a group of debtor countries that organized to repudiate their debt altogether. So basically get in a big group and say, we're not paying this, we're done paying interest, we've paid this for so many years, we need to just get rid of this. And they actually got toppled by the CIA. So we need another one of those. And there might be one actually happening in the next couple of years, organized by Zambia and Egypt. So stay tuned. We also need legislation at national and key jurisdictional levels to put restrictions on predatory debt collection practices. I won't get into it here, but happy to talk more about it in the Q&A if folks are curious about that specific piece of things. And then finally, it'd be really great to do the same thing that we're doing with taxes, with debt, and create a UN sovereign debt convention. That way, instead of these rules being governed by the IMF, they can actually be governed in a more democratic space that represents all countries in, one country, one vote, right? Okay. With that, thank you. That's all I have. Hopefully I convinced a few of you at least that everything is debt and taxes. And I will turn it over to Tori to ask me some questions now, I think.
Yes, I think we are good to go. So, I mean, I have so many questions, but most of them are all what? Like what? But we do have some really great questions that have come in advance of this presentation and some great ones that are coming in the chat. So the first one I'm going to ask is from Melody, who asks, what happens if a country can't pay their debt?
Great. Okay. Also, I just saw in the chat that I was going to leave this up for a few more minutes, so hopefully I didn't mess anything up by stopping sharing my screen too early. Sorry, tech people. Yeah, it's a great question. So what happens when countries can't pay their debt? Well, they default. Usually they can't make payments, so they have to default on it. And this can have really, really devastating economic consequences for a country. A default essentially means that you are shut out of what we call capital markets until you can, make good on your debts, which means that you don't have access to any lending except from the lender of last resort, which is the IMF. Of course, not a place that you want to be. And in order to get out of this situation, you have to restructure your debt as a country. But in the US, when a company defaults, right, we have bankruptcy laws. And this basically organizes a forum. They put all their debts in one space. It helps organize all of the creditors, the different creditors together and say, all right, you're taking this loss, you're taking this loss. It just creates an orderly mechanism to, restructure the debt and make sure that everyone can take the losses that they need to take.
Yeah.
There is no equivalent international bankruptcy court or body for sovereigns. So when a sovereign defaults, they're kind of on their own. Poor countries or lower income countries can qualify for this sort of space called the Common Framework. But the Common Framework, it's been organized by a group of wealthy countries. So the US, the UK, France, etc. And that actually, the process for that is that you first have to go to the IMF. The IMF tells you, you don't tell the IMF, the IMF tells you how much money you need to be sustainable. They do that analysis for you. So, they can just pretty much say whatever they want. And then that becomes your cap that you can receive from debt restructuring. Then you have to go to the Paris Club and say, hey, I need this amount of debt relief. And the Paris Club haggles over it with you until these countries or official creditors say, all right, we're going to give you this amount of relief. And then the Paris Club says, but you have to get that a comparable amount from your private creditors. So then you have to go to your private creditors and say, hey, this is what the official creditors said. Can you give me this amount of money? Now, here's the real problem here. The private creditors are not bound by any sort of laws or rules or regulations to, agree to any of this. So they can basically say, no, we don't want this at all, and prolong your debt restructuring for as long as they want. To make matters worse, these private creditors can actually sue you, usually in foreign courts, usually in New York or London, and can demand full repayment of their debt plus interest. This famously cost Argentina billions of dollars in a court case that dragged on for 10 years, during which time Argentina was paying over 100% per year in interest on this debt. So, these can just cost exorbitant amounts of money. Debt restructurings can take a very, very long time. And in fact, actually, since the Common Framework was created about 5 years ago now, only 4 countries have used it. And only 2 of those have received any sort of debt relief at all. And we could actually haggle about whether or not that's considered debt relief. So, it's a very bad situation when you default because there's no real way to deal with it in an organized manner. And so most countries just choose to what we call extend and pretend, where they just choose not to default, and keep going down this unsustainable debt territory, forcing more austerity on their people, and spending less and less money on essential things like education and healthcare and whatnot. And that is the situation we're in right now.
Of course. Yeah. And we had a question here about, what can be done by the IMF to give more space in some of these multilateral agencies. And it sounds like they could do more, but they have just elected not to till that point. Which kind of brings to the forefront a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about the legislation piece that you hinted to there? I know that you've done some work around that in New York specifically, but what does that legislation ideally look like, and what could the impact of that be? And on behalf of TB fighters, if that is, is there anything that when those efforts come up, we can support potentially?
For sure, yeah. Yeah, so like I said, there's no way to prevent private creditors from, taking these lawsuits to court, aside from contractual clauses that are written into the debt contracts that say, like, you need to have this amount of creditors agree to a certain thing. But those aren't in all debt contracts, and they haven't stopped this behavior by creditors, which we call holdout creditors. At their worst, we call them vulture funds. And actually, because these vulture funds are mostly hedge funds, they're wealth management companies, most of their debt is either denominated in the jurisdiction of New York or London. It's actually just over 50% in New York and like just under 48% in London. The other 2% is like in Belgium and somewhere else. So if we pass legislation in New York State and London, we could actually make it illegal to bring these lawsuits against countries. And New York State actually had a law that said you can't buy debt for the purpose of suing on it until about 2004, when some of these vulture funds actually lobbied for a loophole to that law, which said you can't buy debt for the purpose of suing on it unless it's over $500,000, in which case you're good to go, which is pretty much all sovereign debt transactions, right? So we got to fix that. And there's currently a couple bills going through the New York State legislature, which are, attempting to close that loophole and make it harder for holdouts and vulture funds to bring these lawsuits. There's a comparable bill in the UK, which is making its way through UK courts, and together these could, impact pretty much all of the privately held debt, some $800 billion of it. And not only would this help stop these lawsuits from occurring, actually what it would do is help with the power imbalance that currently exists between private creditors and official creditors and the debtor, right? Because these private creditors, even if they won't do it, they can always threaten, they can go to the finance minister and say, hey, if you don't agree to this horrible deal for you, I'm going to sue you in New York courts. And they have done this in the past, right, with countries. So not only would we, be making this type of behavior illegal, but also we're putting a check on sort of this unlimited power that private creditors have that they use to extract better and better deals out of these restructuring processes. And the bonus of that is, China is actually becoming an increasingly large official creditor. And they have said, like, we need to see comparable deals from private creditors in order to come along and do proper debt relief. So this actually is going to help with the official creditors too, right? Because they'll have a better assurance that the private creditors aren't going to do anything fishy. So then they can say, all right, we're signing off on this. Yeah. One more thing I wanted to mention too on the IMF piece to like close the loop on that, someone's question about what could the IMF be doing? Well, one thing, right, they could be, offering a larger envelope for debt relief, right? When they write that debt sustainability analysis, they could take into account factors like vulnerability to climate, factors like how much are you spending on health, things like this, that they don't pay enough attention to right now. So they could say, based on these vulnerability indexes, you actually need more debt relief, and that'd be good. The other thing that the IMF could do is, because it assumes itself to be a lender of last resort, right? It actually won't cancel any of its debt at all. You can't get a write down on an IMF debt. You can receive more lending from them, but you can't write down your existing debt to them. So they could also cancel their debt. Like nothing's stopping them from doing that. And, we see countries like Malawi where 2/3 of their debt is owed to multilateral development banks like the IMF and the World Bank who won't restructure. And it's becoming more and more clear that as countries just continue to amass more and more lending from these last resorts, it's going to need to be restructured eventually, right? So there's also definitely a role for the IMF in debt cancellation itself.
Right. And are there potentially negative consequences to the IMF just stepping in and doing that? Like what kind of arguments are they saying to stop that?
Yeah, the IMF has a little bit of a weird role here, right? Because they are a creditor. They have debt from these countries, and they're also sort of the mediator in this process, right? So they're all at once supposed to be lending money and being this sort of like, neutral arbitrator in these processes. And, many people have argued that that's a pretty big conflict of interest, because the IMF obviously wants to protect its status as a very well-respected lender because that's how it makes its money, right? Everyone is like, okay, I can always go to the IMF. Um, so yeah, I think that's another point in favor of doing something like this at the UN because then
Mhm.
you like truly can set up a fully democratic body that makes decisions about these things, and then you don't have to rely on the IMF, which is kind of playing a little bit of a double role here.
Right. And I'm sure there are also like incremental solutions that would at least make a difference in the meantime as we work towards those larger
Of
pieces.
course.
And that actually is a perfect segue into a question that we got in the chat from Catherine's Videos 156, who asks, what are the next steps for the UN tax convention? And will we need to pressure the US to vote yes or sign on at some point?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a great question. So the convention is supposed to be finished in 2027. Right now, the UN is hosting three negotiations per year in the lead up to that, where countries are deliberating on what protocols are going to be included in the initial convention. So what is the convention going to tackle first? Beyond that, there's going to be a continuing process. You know how we have like climate conferences every year at the
Yeah.
UN? There's going to be one of those for taxes too. So they'll keep coming back every year to reevaluate and continue making more rules around this. At least
Mhm.
that's the hope. Um, on the US side of things, so the US actually walked out of the UN tax convention process. Um, they are the only country who has walked out of the process. They decided they did not want to be involved. Um, and, actually, uh, originally, like one would think, well, this is kind of a bad thing, right? That the US is walking out of this deal. And, you know, I'd obviously prefer that the US government, like, full on supports something like this and, like, full on, we want a strong convention, we're going to ratify it, blah, 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 all right, all of that good stuff. Um, and actually, ironically, the US would benefit from this, right? Because the US, just like any other government, is getting screwed over by these corporations that are hiding money in tax havens, right? So the US government could actually collect a bunch of revenue from something like this
Mhm.
too,
Yeah.
which the ironic part. But, you know, that aside, um, right now in the current geopolitical situation, there are actually a fair amount of countries that are pretty happy that the US left because, you know, if the US were to stay there, there's a possibility that they spend all their time watering down whatever text that the convention decides on, and then at the very end of the day decides not to ratify it anyway, right? And so with the US out for the time being, countries can feel free to, have stronger negotiations. You don't have to fight the US as much on every single thing you do. Um, and then ideally, in 3 years, 4 years, when we have a new government in the US, hopefully we have a progressive government that sees that this is really important and wants to support it and ratify it. So along the way, we're not waiting, right? We're working with progressive champions in Congress right now to begin to build up support in the US for this so that we're ready to hit the ground running when, such an opportunity does arise. So still very important to talk about it, to
Mhm.
know about it in the US, to like just have it be a thing of importance um, along the way. And so yes, there will be opportunities over these next 3 years to advocate for it, even as the US has walked out of the process right now.
Right. And this is also maybe a chance for our international TV fighters to shine.
Mhm.
So we really do look forward. And again, I cannot emphasize how much we appreciate your partnership and Rosie and Vincent and all of our friends at PIH to let us know when these opportunities come up because, we have so many incredible nerd fighters around the world who are really eager to jump at any chance for things like this because it seems like this is also something that would help TB, but also much
100%.
beyond TB.
Yep. In fact, we probably can't end TB fully without, some of these economic justice changes. So
Right.
yeah, it's really important. And
Yeah.
likewise, from our side, we love working with the TB fighters. You guys are fantastic.
Oh my gosh, we have so many good questions in here too. Um, but okay, I'm gonna go to one really quickly more on the economic side, and then I want to talk more about what economic justice looks like in
Okay.
practice. Um, so we have a really good question from Catherine here that's a little bit more of a logistical one, different Catherine, I think. Um, is there a particular reason that countries are spending specifically from domestic funds on TV programs?
I think there's just not been a whole ton available in aid or external sources for that. Um, the largest portion of the global fund goes towards HIV. And there's a lot of like comorbidities between HIV and TB, right? So treating HIV is good for TB also. But the largest portion of that money goes towards that. And then PEPFAR, which is the other like really large funder, external funder of this stuff, also splits between HIV, TB, and malaria. So I think it's more down to just that there are competing priorities.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the day, right, I'd actually prefer that governments are spending their domestic resources on health and on TB as opposed to relying on these external resources. Because as we very much know from the last couple months, external resources are controlled externally. And so they can be pulled at any time, even if that's not sustainable for a country, which
Mhm.
makes this economic justice work even more critical, right? Because
Mhm.
we need to make sure that countries have the financing envelope that they can spend on uh, you know on these domestic priorities so that they can just use their own money as they should
Mhm.
to be treating these
Right.
things without relying on external
And,
support.
and that's the model, right? To actually build things to be sustainable for the long term
Mhm.
and continue to be able to grow and thrive,
Yeah,
especially with things how they are. And this is just another good moment to plug those call tools that we have in the doobly
yeah,
doo, which are specifically around making sure that the already allocated funds for PEPFAR go out, go out the
absolutely.
door.
Right. And it's really important. We can't just like, create economic sovereignty overnight, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to need these external sources of revenue in the meantime, right? It's very important for the transition to a stronger state of sovereignty. So uh yeah, but let's fight for PEPFAR, let's fight for the Global Fund, let's fight for all of these external funding as well. And also at the same time recognizing that the overarching goal of all of this should
Mhm.
be economic sovereignty.
Right. Um, and so that actually brings me to one of the favorite questions that two of them, I'm going to ask them concurrently because I think that they relate really well together. So these come from Sarah and Celeste, which is, can you share some examples of where economic justice principles were implemented on the ground and how they affected health in the area? And in order to make progress on economic justice, what pieces of the puzzle are we most lacking right now? And in parallel to that, we also have the question of what does a fully resourced global TB response look like, and how far away are we from that? Because I think those two pieces kind of go hand in hand.
Hmm. Yeah, man, those are great questions. um okay, so for economic justice principles on the ground, there's this really great study from 2008 actually. um it's, if you want to look into it, it's like Stuckler et al. And just type in like TB and IMF and it'll come up. Where they actually studied the impact of IMF programs on countries' TB burdens, and they found that the presence of an IMF program in a country was associated with a like 13% increase in tuberculosis incidence and a 16% increase in tuberculosis mortality. And every year that the IMF program remained in the country, um, these numbers went up by like 1 to 4%. And then the reverse was true, right? When the country left the IMF program, tuberculosis incidence and mortality rates went down. And I really think we need to do another one of those studies for like 2025. But it's, I think it's a really fantastic um, sort of example of what austerity looks like. Like tuberculosis is, a disease of poverty. It's a social disease, right? Like, so when we're doing austerity programs in countries, people don't have access to food and fuel and,
Yeah.
like
And,
financial
right.
resources.
And we just
And
heard from Joya last week too that
right,
treating tuberculosis without food is like washing your hands and then wiping them in the dirt, right?
amazing.
It
Yes,
all connects them together there.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think a great example of, an economic justice program working to treat tuberculosis is literally just like give people food, give people, a certain amount of money so they can go buy food. It's actually better to just give them food, but things like that, that are just proven to like really decrease the rate of which people are contracting and dying of tuberculosis. Is just, yeah, a fantastic example in my mind. Okay, let me try to remember the other parts of this question.
I can bring them back up. So we had examples of economic justice principles implemented on the ground, how they affect health. What pieces of the puzzle are missing right now to really make that come to life?
Hmm. I think one of the big misconceptions in the global health space, in the development space, um, is that philanthropy is going to save us. That the this World Bank idea of billions to trillions, right? Private or public sector puts forward billions of dollars, and the private sector puts forward trillions of dollars. And the World Bank said that in 2015 or earlier, I think, never happened, never materialized. In fact, what we've
Shocking.
seen is the reverse, right? Actually, in the past 2 years in a row now, um, private creditors have actually extracted more from poor countries in debt payments than they have provided in new lending and new financing. So they're actually pulling money out, right? Especially when economic conditions are bad, they pull money out. Um, so yeah, it's a really big misconception, I think, that philanthropy and the private sector is going to save us. It's not true. The only thing that's going to save us is public sector dollars and economic sovereignty.
Yeah. And I think that also kind of talks about what that fully resourced global TB response would look like. It's taking that holistic approach. It's
Mm-hmm.
addressing not just the disease where it is, but the root causes that enable the disease to spread the way that it does.
Yep.
Um, yeah, we can talk about this literally all night. But, and I think we probably have. But there's a couple questions here about specifically more of the advocacy standpoint, and I want to touch on those a little bit because I know that these conversations really create that energy and people wanting to take action. So we've got questions here from Jay and Celeste. And Jay asks that personal fundraising is obviously incredibly important for all of the model pieces, but what can we do and what tips for this world of activism do we have when many people want to donate, but it's not great for anybody right now and they don't necessarily have the resources. And then the question that we also have here from Celeste is that many people are willing to take part in entry-level advocacy actions like signing petitions or emailing legislators, but what's been effective in helping supporters grow more active in those advocacy roles? So
Mm.
it's a little bit of a what else can we do? How do we help?
All right. Great questions. I'll try to be quick because I know we're reaching the end of our time here. Um, as far as personal fundraising, I just got done saying that philanthropy is not going to save us. So, it's not going to save
But
us.
it'll help,
It'll
in the meantime.
absolutely, right? It helps in the meantime. Absolutely. Um, 2 things there. I think like economic justice is like it is wherever we are, right? And so there's, the injustice between the global north and the global south. There's also injustice like just in the US itself, right? We're an extremely unequal society just across the globe. Actually, societies are becoming more and more unequal as, the top, 50 or the top 1% owns 50% of the wealth in the US now, and the bottom 50 owns like less than 5%. So this is a huge economic injustice in the US. And that means it's going to impact us personally, right? And so, and all of these concepts are connected to each other, right? So fighting economic injustice in the US also is like contributing to the global fight against it, and just like staying informed and being aware of how that impacts our own lives, I think is a really important piece of that. Um, and the other thing I tell people when donating, or I, I tell myself at least, is like, um, you know, I might, miss my coffee, or like, do I really need to pay for the Spotify without ads? Like, I'm never going to be as uncomfortable as someone like dying of tuberculosis and not having access to medicine. So I think like also a little bit of a challenge, like make ourselves a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, because this is just an uncomfortable reality, right? None of us should feel comfortable living in this reality.
Right.
And then aside from all that, right, you don't even have to donate, right? You can use your time and your talents in other ways. There's advocacy, the links that you can call your members of Congress, email your members of Congress after this, or your members of Parliament. Um, and I think as far as like taking steps beyond just, making a phone call after hours, I think really it's about like bringing along people when you're taking further advocacy steps. Like, let's say you're calling during business hours or doing a meeting with a member of Congress or like going to a protest or something, bringing people along and then showing them how fun it is. Like, I mean, seriously, like, I think there's something really like joyful in realizing that you like, can use your voice to make a difference and that you do have an amount of power in this situation, right? Like our representatives ultimately work for us. And like I know our government is
Something.
yeah. um, but I would really encourage like all the people who are tuning into this, like you do have an amount of power and it actually is it's very like healing and refreshing to be able to like put your body and your thoughts and your talents into action for the causes that you care about. I know that's why the TB fighters do like such incredible work, right? Like you guys could all speak to that. So yeah.
But I think especially to how do you get people more willing to go beyond those initial steps? Bringing people with you. That's why we never kind of do it by ourselves. We have our call sessions where we join them together and we just, there are other people with us. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't know what to do or are a little bit nervous. And that's kind of where the community aspect of it comes in. Like we can all just jump on a Google Meet and make our calls and then, have that together. And it just makes it easier for people more relatively new to the space to take that step. It's kind of our own type of accompaniment here
Yeah.
in the advocacy. And so I think we have time for one more question. And selfishly, this one is for me. Um, because one of the things that I really admire most about you, Chloe, and one of your strengths that several of our friends have pointed out is that despite the significant headwinds in the worlds of TV and especially in economic justice, you maintain a level of optimism that is incredibly rare when despair and hopelessness are the natural options. And it's clear that that optimism is in spite of those challenges and doesn't come from just pretending that they don't exist and everything's going to work out fine. You're very much a realist and aware of what the challenges are. So to kind of end us on a more hopeful note, can you talk for a minute about how you do that and some of the things that are giving you hope in this space right now?
Oh, well, first of all, that's very kind of you. Thank you. I do try. I think it's really hard to do this work and not be optimistic, right? Like, especially for young people, um, it's I don't want to exist in a world where there's not a better future in front of us and where we're not actively working towards that. Um, uh, you know, there's this great David Graeber quote, one of my favorite economists. He says that like I'm going to totally butcher the quote, but um, you know, essentially that the only truth about the world is that like we make it and we could just as easily make it differently. Um, and and so I think um, knowing that there are good people working at pulling on every thread possible in the spaces that just have so much injustice and suffering really keeps me going, right? Like I can be working on my own teeny tiny like piece of it and someone else is working from the other end on their own teeny tiny piece of it. And together we're like all working together to unravel this huge, mess. And yeah, so I think especially when I work with folks like the TB fighters who are so excited and enthusiastic and just really like throwing all of their talents into these things and doing a fantastic job, right? Or our PIH Engage network of folks just fearlessly like learning about all these things and continuing to push even when it feels futile. That really keeps me going. Being on the streets with folks and protesting and whatnot is also something that I really rely on for hope and power in this space. And then also just like the communities that we do this for, right? Like I won't speak for everyone. I have a ton of privilege to be able to do this, to like get paid for this work, to think about this like on the job all the time. But like on the other end of this, right, there are like communities in the global south and in these countries who are living with tuberculosis and who are still like pushing back, who are putting themselves at much higher risk to push back against these systems of oppression, and they've been doing this for a long time, right? Thomas Sankara, who I quoted earlier, was murdered for this, right? So also just like the amount of resilience and risk that others are putting themselves into in order to fight back and fight for better worlds. I think
Mhm.
also just yeah, if I had to end on a hopeful note, I
Yeah.
think that's it. And really, I do like very strongly and confidently believe that there's a better world out there and that we're going to end TB within our lifetimes. And I'm so excited to do it with all of you.
And you are one of the smartest people I know, so I'm going to believe you on that.
Good.
Um, I mean, that is a good note to end on. I know we're a little over time, so thank you again for just being so generous with your time and your resources, and for everybody who submitted questions and who's joined us tonight. We really appreciate that. I've got a couple of in-between announcements, and then I'm going to let everybody know who our very, very exciting October guest is going to be, because we're so excited, and again, very grateful. So the quick announcements are our TB Readers Book Club is currently reading The Underdream by Ayanna Masla, which is an incredible book of poetry written by a TB survivor. We are doing a live Q&A around that book of poetry. You don't have to, finish the book prior to joining us for that. It's still an incredible conversation, and that's going to take place on October 21st at 4 p.m. Eastern. If you want reminders about our calls to action, our events, everything like this, you can sign up for our newsletter. I believe the link for that is also in the doobly-doo, or it's right there on our website. And we've talked so much about our US and Canada calls to action that I can actually just skip that bullet point that I have here. So with, the moment that I've been waiting to tell everybody about, I don't know if everybody's been as anxiously waiting for it as I am, but on October 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern, so that is Monday, October 27th, we are going to be joined by the one and only Dr. Carol Mitnick, who is, I think, one of all of our TB heroes. And Carol is going to talk to us about Libre TB, a pilot intervention to address post-TB lung disease, which is, really exciting work that she's been doing in Peru. So we hope that we will see you there. Question submission for that is probably going to open up later tonight. And we are, again, just so excited. So the final thing after all of our thank yous is, as they say in our hometown, don't forget to be
Don't forget
awesome.
to be awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.